Vernon Holt was 74 years old and had kept bees for 50 years. His wife Ida had spent 30 years redesigning land that other people said could not be saved. When the county auctioned a dead orchard on Pear Creek Road for back taxes, they bid $840 while the town watched and shook their heads. Mayor Crane drove past the property the following week and told the county assessor it should have been bulldozed, not listed. Their daughter called from the city and asked if they had lost their minds. Vernon stood in the dead orchard on the first morning and pressed his palm against the largest tree and said the roots are still there. Ida knelt in the soil and said, "So is everything else." On the 43rd day, they opened a hatch in the floor of a collapsed barn and found something that a man named Edgar Voss had left for them 50 years before he knew their names. But I need to take you back to the beginning. Vernon Holt had kept bees for 50 years in the specific way that some people keep a language alive. Not as a hobby, not as a weekend pursuit, as a daily practice that shaped how he understood everything around him, the way a musician hears music in ordinary sound or the way a carpenter sees structure in every building they walk through. He knew what bees needed and what they returned, and he understood the relationship between pollinators and fruit trees with the intimacy of someone who had watched that relationship play out across half a century of seasons on more pieces of land than he could easily count. He was 74 years old, and he had never once stopped paying attention to what his bees were telling him about the world they worked in. Ida had been a landscape designer for 30 years before her knees made the physical demands too costly, and she had set it aside at 63, cleanly and without extended mourning, the way practical people set things down. She had a specific gift for reading land, for understanding the way water moved across a slope and how light fell through different seasons and what plants could become when someone gave them the right conditions. She had designed 3 public parks and a waterfront promenade and a dozen private gardens over her career, most of them on land that other people had called too difficult or too damaged or too far gone to be worth the effort. She had never once agreed with those assessments, and she had been right every time. They had been married for 49 years. They had raised a daughter named Clara, who lived in the city and worked in finance, and called every Sunday with the careful, measured concern of someone who had decided to be responsible about her parents without quite knowing how. They had lived in the same rented house on Millhaven's east side for 22 years, a modest place with a yard that Vernon had filled with hives along the south fence line, and Ida had planted with a layered perennial structure that looked entirely natural and was entirely deliberate. They had very little money and a great deal of knowledge and a partnership built through 4 decades of working on difficult things side by side. The tax auction notice appeared in the Millhaven Gazette on a Thursday morning in late February. 3 acres of orchard land on Pear Creek Road, delinquent on property taxes for 11 years, minimum opening bid the total of taxes owed, $840. Vernon read it twice at the kitchen table while Ida was washing dishes. Then he called her name and held up the paper. She dried her hands and came and read it standing beside him. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she went to the counter drawer and took out a fresh notebook, a plain composition book, and wrote the date on the inside cover and underneath it, Pear Creek Road, first entry. She looked at Vernon. She said, "Let us go and see it." They drove out that afternoon in the February cold, the sky low and flat over the fields on either side of the county road. The orchard sat behind a rusted wire fence at the end of a gravel track, 3 acres of apple and pear trees that had been allowed to decline over 11 years of complete neglect. The trees were unpruned, strangled by suckers, damaged by seasons of unchecked disease, their lower branches carrying the gray-brown of wood that has been suffering for a long time. Ida got out of the truck and walked directly to the fence and stood looking at the grade of the land. She was reading the slope in the way she had always read slopes, watching in her mind where water would collect after rain, and where the afternoon light would fall in the growing season, and what the relationship between the two meant for what grew in between. Vernon walked the fence line slowly. He was not looking at the trees themselves. He was looking at the ground around their bases, at the specific way the soil held moisture despite the winter cold, at the texture of the bark on the lower trunks, at the precise color of the wood where old branches had broken and new wood had tried to grow beneath. He stopped at the largest apple tree near the center of the property and pressed his palm flat against the bark and held it there. The tree was suffering. It had been suffering for a long time, but the root system beneath it was alive. He could read that in half a dozen ways that he could not have explained adequately to someone who had not spent 50 years learning to read the same things. The tree wanted to live. All of them did. They were not finished. They were waiting. Ida appeared beside him. She had the notebook out and was writing. She said the drainage is entirely wrong for this slope. Someone planted these trees without reading how the water moves across this land. Half of them have been fighting their own soil their entire lives. He said every root system he had checked was intact, every single one. She looked up from the notebook at the rows of damaged trees and then back down at what she had written. Then she turned slowly, reading the whole 3 acres the way she had always read a landscape, not as what it was, but as what it was asking to become. She said if we correct the drainage and bring the hives, he said the trees will do the rest. She said $840 was most of what they had. He said he knew. She said there would be nothing left if this did not work. He said he knew that too. She put the cap back on her pen and looked at him. She said, "Well then, they had better be right." The tax auction was held in the county courthouse on a Tuesday morning in early March. The room held perhaps 20 people, local property owners and a pair of speculators who made the county auctions a regular habit. Mayor Gerald Crane was not present, but his opinion of the Pear Creek Road listing was, carried into the room by a man from the county planning office who had heard the mayor's view and shared it in the way that small towns share authority, through repetition and proximity. The auctioneer read the Pear Creek Road listing in the flat voice of someone who expected nothing interesting to result from it. Opening bid $840. Nobody moved. Vernon raised his hand. He heard something said behind him. He did not turn around. He kept his eyes forward and his hand in the air until the gavel came down. Sold to number 31. Outside the courthouse, he and Ida signed the paperwork, received a key that had not been used in at least a decade, and drove directly to Pear Creek Road to stand in the orchard they now owned and look at it in the clear, cold morning light as people who had made a decision and were now responsible for what it became. Word moved through Mill Haven by the following morning, carried through the diner and the post office and the hardware store in the way that information about unusual decisions moves through small towns, with the particular pleasure of a community confirming what it had always suspected about its more eccentric residents. By Thursday morning, 3 separate conversations at the diner on Main Street had reached the same conclusion. Vernon and Ida Holt had spent their savings on 3 acres of dead trees and a barn that had collapsed into itself at some point in the previous decade. The auctioneer had been asked about it and had said only that the sale had proceeded legally and that the purchasers had appeared to understand what they were signing. This did not reassure anyone particularly. A man who had known Vernon for 20 years said that Vernon had always been stubborn about his bees, and that stubbornness had apparently expanded to include dead orchards. A woman who was a friend of Clara's said she thought someone should reach out to the daughter. Mayor Gerald Crane heard about it on Friday afternoon from the man at the county planning office who had been at the auction. Crane was 61 years old and had been running Millhaven for 9 years with the specific conviction of a man who had decided that the town's condition was a direct reflection of his own competence and who therefore took an active interest in anything that might reflect poorly on it. He drove past the Pear Creek Road property on Saturday morning, slowed to look at it through his window for perhaps 15 seconds, and called the county assessor from his car. He said he was not certain what the county had been thinking listing that property for public auction in its current condition, when the responsible action would have been to write it off and have it cleared. He said whoever had acquired it was going to be significantly disappointed. He said it might be appropriate to have someone reach out to the purchasers to make sure they understood what they had taken on before the situation became a problem for the county to manage. The county assessor said the sale had been conducted legally and properly and that the county's responsibility to the purchasers had concluded at the signing. The mayor said he had not suggested otherwise. He drove back to town. At the post office the following Monday, a woman mentioned she had seen Ida out at the property the day before, crouching in the mud, looking at the soil, and making notes in a book, which the woman described to the postmaster as concerning, which the postmaster relayed to the next 3 people who came in for stamps, each of whom relayed it further in the specific telephone game of small-town concern that sounds like caring and sometimes is something else wearing caring's face. Clara called that evening from the city. She said she had heard about the orchard. Ida said news traveled efficiently. Clara said she was worried. She said $840 was a significant portion of their liquid savings and that a project of this scale was not something 2 people in their 70s should be attempting alone, and that she could come home the following weekend if they needed someone to help them think through the situation more carefully. Ida said they had already thought it through. Vernon, who was in the kitchen doorway listening, said they had been taking on difficult things for 49 years and had a reasonable record of seeing them through. Clara said that was not entirely the point. Ida said it was the only point and that they would see her at Christmas and that she should not spend her Sunday worrying. They began work on the Monday after the auction. Vernon brought 2 hives in the bed of the truck, wrapped against the cold for the drive, and set them at the southern end of the property near the creek where the morning sun came earliest and the bees would have immediate access to whatever forage the surrounding landscape offered. He set up the hives with the unhurried precision of someone who has done this in every kind of weather across half a century and knows that getting it right at the beginning is worth the extra time. He opened the entrance reducers halfway, enough for the bees to orient to the new location without becoming overwhelmed by the cold air, and stepped back and watched. The first foragers left the hive within 20 minutes. He tracked their flight direction with his eyes. The direction a forager chooses on the first morning in a new location tells a beekeeper something about the surrounding landscape that no map or survey communicates as efficiently or as honestly, because the bee is reading the landscape with instruments more sensitive than anything a human brings to the task. What they chose told him the hedgerow along the creek was alive with early bloom, despite the lingering cold of early March. It told him the land was not as dead as it looked. It told him what he already believed but needed confirmation of. The orchard had something to give. It simply needed someone to understand what it was asking for first. Ida was already working. She had identified the drainage problem on their first visit, and she addressed it the way she had always addressed landscape problems, by watching what the land was already trying to do and removing the obstacles between it and that intention rather than imposing a new intention on top of the old one. A previous owner had installed a shallow irrigation channel decades ago that had collapsed over the years and created a subtle berm across the central section of the slope, barely visible to the eye but significant in its effect, holding water against the root zones of the central trees for too long after each rainfall. She corrected it with a spade and 3 afternoons of work, cutting drainage channels by reading the grade with her feet rather than a level, because 30 years of this work had taught her body to feel slope in a way that a measuring instrument confirmed but did not replace. Vernon worked the trees in parallel throughout those same 3 afternoons. He pruned the suckers from the base of each trunk, cleared the competing growth that had been stealing light and nutrition for 11 years, cut back the water shoots that were drawing energy from the productive wood, and treated the bark damage from seasons of unchecked disease with the methodical patience of someone who has learned not to rush work that cannot be hurried. He moved from the southern boundary northward, 1 tree at a time, and each evening when the light began to fail, he and Ida walked the rows together. She told him where the water was moving correctly now, and where she suspected additional corrections would be needed once the spring rains came properly. He told her what the bees had been visiting during the day, which sections of the orchard they were working with the greatest energy, which individual trees were already showing the early signals of recovery that a healthy bee population detects before a human eye has the information to do so. They were reading the same orchard from 2 different directions every day, and every evening they compared what they had found, and the picture that emerged from both readings together was always more complete than either of them could have assembled alone. This was how they had always worked, not one leading and one following, both leading in their own direction, both trusting the other's reading, and meeting somewhere in the middle where the full picture lived. A retired farmer named Leonard, who worked the property adjacent to the northern fence, had been watching them from his side of the wire for 2 weeks, before he drove around to the gate on a Tuesday morning with a thermos of coffee and knocked. He was the kind of man who formed opinions slowly and offered help in the same way, only when he was confident it was warranted. Vernon told him what they were doing. Leonard looked at the hives at the southern end, at the drainage work visible in the central section, at the pruned trees whose branch tips were already showing the specific new growth of wood that has been relieved of a long burden. He poured coffee into the thermos cap and handed it to Ida. He said the original owner of this orchard was named Edgar Voss. He said Voss had farmed the land from the 1920s until his death in 1968. He said the family had sold it shortly afterward for almost nothing. Said the orchard had never been productive and was not worth keeping. Vernon asked if Voss had kept records. Leonard said he had no idea. Vernon asked if anyone had been inside the barn. Leonard looked at the collapsed structure at the far end of the property. He said as far as he knew nobody had entered it in decades. He assumed it was empty. Most people assumed that about things they had not checked. Vernon said they were going to find out. But not yet. The trees needed their attention first, and the bees needed time to establish, and the drainage needed to prove itself across several rain events before Ida was confident it was working, as she intended. It was working. The central section of the orchard where water had been standing too long began showing the recovery that comes when roots that have been fighting poor conditions are finally given what they need. Not overnight, not dramatically, steadily and unmistakably, in the way of living things that have been waiting for something and have finally received it. Vernon's bees worked the orchard from dawn to dusk. That was the detail nobody in Millhaven could easily explain when they drove past and saw it. 2 old people in a dead orchard, moving slowly through the rows with tools and notebooks, and around them and through them, this constant motion of bees working the property with an energy that seemed disproportionate to the condition of the trees. What the bees were doing was what bees have always done in an orchard that is coming back. They were facilitating what the trees were preparing for, working the early flowers on the hedgerow and the creek bank, and the first tentative blossoms appearing on the recovered trees in the southern section. What the bees understood before anyone else was that this orchard was not dead. It had simply been waiting for the right conditions. For someone who knew how to read water on a slope, for someone who knew what bees could tell you about a piece of land if you watched which direction they flew on the first morning. For two people who had spent their working lives developing exactly those two kinds of knowledge and who had been married long enough to use them together without having to explain to each other what they were doing or why. Millhaven did not know any of this yet. Millhaven was still at the stage of driving past the property slowly and shaking its head and waiting to be proven right about the old couple and the dead orchard and the $840. The mayor had made his call to the county assessor. The diner had reached its consensus. Clara had expressed her concern. Everyone who had an opinion had expressed it. Vernon and Ida had heard all of it and gone back to the orchard and kept working. That was the only response available to them and the only one that mattered. On the 43rd day, Vernon and Ida turned their attention to the barn. The structure had collapsed inward sometime in the previous decade, the roof folding down into the interior and pulling most of the wall framing with it. Working around the collapsed sections required care and patience and the specific coordination of two people who have worked in close physical proximity for long enough that they anticipate each other without speaking. Vernon worked with the pry bar and Ida with the spade, and they cleared debris together, passing materials between them, working from the outside edge toward the center of the collapsed floor. The floor was flagstone, old and solid, laid by someone who had taken the work seriously. Ida saw the difference first. In the northeastern corner, the flagstones were laid in a pattern that was too deliberate to be accidental. Each stone was fitted against the next with a precision that exceeded the rest of the floor, the joints almost invisible, the surface perfectly level in a way that the rest of the floor was not. She had spent 30 years designing outdoor stone surfaces, and she recognized intentional patterning when she stood on it. She called Vernon over and pointed. He crouched and ran his hand across the joints. They looked at each other. They lifted the stones together, prying each one carefully with the bar, setting them aside in the order they came up so they could be returned to the same positions. The flagstones gave way cleanly, one by one, as though they had been fitted to be found rather than to stay permanently. Beneath the last layer of stone was a wooden hatch of old pine planking, fitted with a simple iron ring, sealed by decades of settled earth around its edges, but structurally sound underneath. The wood was dry. The room below it had been keeping it dry. Vernon put the pry bar under the iron ring and leaned his weight into it. The hatch opened with a sound like a breath being released after a very long time of being held. The air that came up from below was cold and dry and specific in the way of a sealed underground space that has maintained its own climate for decades, removed from the temperature changes and the moisture of the seasons above it. Ida went to the truck and came back with the flashlight. They descended together into a room that had not been entered since Edgar Voss sealed it sometime in the 1960s. The cold storage was dug 8 feet into the hillside, lined with local stone that had been laid with the same care as the flagstones above, fitted tightly without mortar, relying on the precision of the placement to hold. Simple wooden shelving ran floor to ceiling on 3 walls, built from the same pine as the hatch, dry and intact. The shelving on 2 of those walls was empty. The 3rd wall was not. Stacked in careful order, each one wrapped in waxed cloth that had preserved them against the cold, dry air of 50 years of sealed storage, were notebooks. Vernon swept the flashlight beam along the shelving and counted without meaning to, because counting was how he processed things that were larger than he expected. 43. He set the flashlight on the bottom shelf so the beam pointed upward and lit the room from below. He lifted the nearest notebook from the stack and unwrapped the cloth with the hands of someone who understood they were handling something that had been placed here with intention. The waxed cloth fell away cleanly, preserved by the cold. He opened the cover. The handwriting inside was small and precise, the handwriting of someone who wrote a great deal and had learned to make each page count. At the top of the first page was a date, April 1922, and below it a single heading written with the particular care of a first page that knows it is the beginning of something long. Voss Orchard, Cultivation Records, Year 1. Vernon turned back to the inside cover. 3 words were written there in the same careful hand, positioned in the center of the page, slightly larger than the rest of the text, as though they had been written deliberately last, after the rest of the notebook was already full, as the final act of a man who was sealing something underground and wanted whoever opened it to know immediately that it had been meant for them. For the finder, he handed the notebook to Ida. She read the inside cover in the beam of the upward-pointing flashlight. She read it twice. Then she turned to the first page and read that. Then she looked at Vernon in the cold underground room, both of them standing among the shelves of a man's 50-year work, wrapped in waxed cloth, and addressed to a person Edgar Voss had never met. She said he wrote that on every one. Vernon said he believed so. She said Voss spent 50 years keeping records of this orchard and sealed them underground and wrote for the finder on every notebook, and then he died and the family sold the land and nobody ever looked in the root cellar. Vernon said that appeared to be exactly what had happened. She looked at the wrapped stacks on the shelving for a long moment. She said they had bought 50 years of somebody else's education for $840. Vernon said they had. She reached out and set her hand flat on the nearest wrapped stack and held it there. She said for the finder. She said it quietly, the way you say something when you are understanding it for the first time after reading it twice. She said it was them. If you have made it this far into Vernon and Ida's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I have been waiting to tell you. They carried all 43 notebooks to the farmhouse they had begun renting at the edge of the property and stacked them on the kitchen table and sat down together and did not move for 3 hours. Then they made supper and came back to the table and read some more. They did this every evening for 3 weeks. The notebooks were what Vernon had hoped, and more than either of them had prepared for. Voss had been a systematic and careful observer, with the specific patience of someone who understood that an orchard teaches on its own schedule, and that the only correct response to that schedule is sustained attention across many seasons, not 1 or 2, but dozens, accumulated until the patterns become visible. He had documented every variety cultivated on the property by name, with notes on what each one needed, and what each one gave back in a good year, and what conditions it required to get through a difficult one without permanent damage. He had recorded soil observations and drainage notes across 50 years of varying weather that told Ida not only that she had been right about the central drainage correction, but that 3 additional subtler issues existed in the eastern section of the orchard that she had not yet identified. She went out the following morning and walked the eastern section with Voss's notes in her hand and found all 3 exactly where he had described them, which produced in her the specific feeling of receiving confirmation from someone who had been standing in the same place half a century before. He had written about the bees, not with a beekeeper's knowledge, because Voss had not been a beekeeper, but with the close and honest observation of a man who had noticed over many seasons what his orchard did when the wild pollinator population along the creek corridor was healthy, and what it did when it was not. He had spent years trying to encourage that population by maintaining the hedgerow, leaving the creek bank wild rather than clearing it, and planting specific flowering plants along the orchard's southern edge based on his own observation of what attracted the most activity. He had been doing, imperfectly and by patient trial and error alone, the same work that Vernon was doing with deliberate knowledge and managed hives. There was an entry in Notebook 27, written in the spring of 1951, that Vernon read 3 times and then read aloud to Ida. Voss had written that he believed the orchard would produce as it should if someone ever gave the bees what they needed and gave the trees what they needed at the same time. He wrote that he had tried to do both, but that doing both alone was too much for one person. He wrote that this orchard needed two people who each understood one half of it. He wrote that he hoped such a pair would someday find the property. Vernon set the notebook down on the table. Ida looked at him. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Voss had been solving the same problems they were solving. He had been doing it alone, with only his own careful attention and the tools of his era, and he had gotten most of it right by the end, and he had understood what he could not accomplish alone, and he had sealed all of it underground and addressed it to whoever came after. Vernon and Ida read those notebooks the way you read something that was written for you specifically, even when the person writing it did not know your name and could not have known it and believed in you anyway. The 11 varieties that Vernon could not find in any current catalog were the detail that changed the scope of what they had found. He had been cross-referencing Voss's variety notes against every heritage catalog and agricultural database that Leonard could help him access, working through the list systematically in the evenings after the orchard work was done. Most of the varieties Voss had cultivated across 50 years appeared in standard heritage records, but 11 of them did not appear anywhere. 11 distinct apple and pear varieties, documented by Voss across multiple decades of careful cultivation records, existed in no current catalog, commercial or preservation. Leonard said Vernon needed to call the university. The professor, who drove out 3 weeks later, was a specialist in heritage fruit varieties who had spent her career documenting and attempting to preserve what commercial agriculture had discarded across the 20th century. She was not easily surprised. She had been doing this work for 30 years, and she had learned to hold her expectations low when people called about unusual finds, because unusual finds usually turned out to be misidentified common varieties. She walked the orchard with Vernon for most of a morning, moving through the rows, reading the labels he had placed based on Voss's records, taking photographs and making notes in her own small notebook. She was professionally reserved and asked questions in the measured way of someone gathering evidence before forming conclusions. Then she reached the northeastern section of the orchard and stopped at a tree that had been among the most severely damaged on the property when Vernon and Ida arrived. A tree Vernon had spent 2 careful weeks restoring, treating the bark damage, clearing the root zone, addressing the specific drainage problem that Voss's records had identified for that corner of the property. She looked at the label. She was quiet for a long moment. The tree was in early blossom, not fully open but clearly preparing, the bud clusters at the tips of every branch showing the pale cream of imminent bloom. The new growth that had emerged since Vernon's restoration work was strong and clean. The bark had responded well to treatment. The entire tree had the particular energy of something that has been properly attended to after a very long time of being left alone. She said this variety was last formally documented as a living specimen in 1971. She said the record at that time showed 3 known trees, all in institutional collections, none of them producing viable fruit. She said she was looking at a tree that appeared to be producing viable fruit. She looked at Vernon. She said, "Where did this come from?" He said it had been here the entire time. He said Edgar Voss had documented it in cultivation records spanning 30 years. He said the notebook entries were specific about its location in the orchard, its particular requirements, and what it produced in a good season. She looked at the notebooks he had brought out in a canvas bag. She had been aware of them since she arrived, but had been working through the trees first. She said she needed to see the notebooks. They went back to the farmhouse, and she sat at the kitchen table, and Vernon set the canvas bag in front of her. She lifted the first notebook and opened the cover and read the date, April 1922. She turned to the inside cover and read the 3 words Voss had written there. She looked up at Vernon and Ida standing on the other side of the table. She said for the finder. She said it the same way Ida had said it in the root cellar, as though she was understanding it for the first time after reading it once. She opened the notebook fully and began to read. She was at the kitchen table for 3 hours. When she finally sat back, she said that what Edgar Voss had documented across 43 notebooks represented one of the most significant undiscovered heritage variety records she had encountered in 30 years of this work. She said 11 distinct varieties that she had personal knowledge of as extinct or presumed extinct were documented in these records across multiple decades of active cultivation. She said the trees themselves, recovering visibly in the orchard outside, were living evidence that Voss's records were accurate. She said she needed to make some phone calls. She also said that Voss's notebooks were as important to her field as the trees themselves, that the cultivation records, the specific observations about what each variety needed and how it responded across different seasons, were the kind of generational knowledge that her field spent enormous resources trying to reconstruct and almost never found intact. She said Voss had done 50 years of preservation work alone and in secret, and had left it in the ground for someone to find. She said she did not know whether to call that tragic or extraordinary. Ida said from across the table that it was both, and that both was the right answer. The County Horticultural Register designated the Pear Creek Road orchard a heritage site of state significance 4 months after the professor's visit. The designation came with a preservation grant and with the particular kind of attention that neither Vernon nor Ida had expected or especially wanted, journalists and researchers and county officials who had not previously expressed interest in the property, all finding reasons to drive out to Pear Creek Road. They accepted the attention because it brought resources the restoration needed and because Edgar Voss deserved to have his 50 years of work known. A regional magazine sent a journalist who spent 2 days at the property reading excerpts from Voss's notebooks and walking the orchard with Vernon and Ida, and writing a feature that ran under the headline, 50 Years for the Finder. The story described the notebooks and the 11 extinct varieties and the 3 words written inside the cover of all 43 of them. It described the couple who had paid $840 for 3 acres of dead trees and who had found beneath a collapsed barn a man's half-century of careful work addressed to whoever came after him. The feature was picked up by a national agricultural publication the following week. Mayor Gerald Crane read it on a Sunday morning at his kitchen table. He drove out to Pear Creek Road that afternoon. He parked on the gravel track and got out of his car and stood at the fence. The orchard was in full blossom. This was the first full spring after Vernon and Ida's restoration work, and the orchard that had produced nothing in 11 years was flowering with the particular abundance of trees that have been properly understood and cared for after a long time of neither. Vernon's bees moved through the blossoms in the dense, purposeful way of a healthy hive, working a source it approves of, and the sound of them was a constant warm presence that carried to the road. Leonard came around from his property and stood beside the mayor without being invited because Leonard had watched the whole year unfold from his side of the fence and had his own views about the person standing next to him. The mayor said it was something. Leonard said it was. The mayor was quiet for a moment, looking at the flowering orchard and the hives at the southern end and the rebuilt barn that stood straight now where the collapsed structure had been. He said he had called the county assessor when he drove past the year before and suggested that elderly residents making an impractical financial decision might benefit from some kind of outreach. Leonard said he had heard about that. The mayor said he had been wrong about the property and wrong about the decision and wrong about the people who made it, and he owed them an apology. Leonard said he expected they would appreciate hearing that from him directly. Crane knocked on the farmhouse door that evening. Vernon answered. The mayor stood on the step and said he owed them an apology, and he was delivering it. He said he had been wrong on every count. Vernon said he appreciated that. There was a pause in which the mayor appeared to be waiting for something further. Vernon did not offer anything further. The mayor nodded and thanked him for his time and walked back to his car and drove down the gravel track toward the road. Clara drove from the city the weekend after the national feature ran. She walked the orchard with her parents on a Saturday afternoon, listening to her father explain what the bees had been telling him about the land's recovery across the year, and her mother explained the drainage work, and how Voss's records had confirmed and refined what she had read in the slope on that first February afternoon. She stopped at the tree the professor had identified and looked at the label and at the heavy blossom clusters on every branch. She said she had told them not to do this. Ida said she remembered. Clara said she had been wrong. She said it without qualification, looking at both her parents while she said it, which was the same way she had always said things her entire adult life, directly and without softening, even when what she was saying this time was an admission rather than a warning. Vernon said she had been worried about them. He said that was not the same as being wrong about that. She took her father's arm and they walked the rest of the rows together, while Ida walked on the other side, and the bees moved through the blossoms around all three of them. The first harvest came in the autumn, modest by commercial standards, extraordinary in variety. 31 distinct apple and pear varieties filling the crates that Leonard had helped build from timber he and Vernon had salvaged from the barn renovation and fitted together on 3 Saturdays, while Ida drew the dimensions and checked the joints, and told them both when something was not quite level, which Leonard took more readily than Vernon did, because Leonard had not been told his whole life that he had a good eye. 11 varieties so rare that the university's research team was present for the picking. 3 researchers and the professor who had sat at the kitchen table with the notebooks, all of them moving through the rows with the attentiveness of people witnessing something they had not expected to see in their professional lifetimes. The professor stopped at the tree she had identified on her first visit, the one whose variety had been listed as commercially extinct since 1971, and stood looking at the fruit hanging from its branches. Real fruit, viable, the kind that a tree produces when it has been given what it needs by people who understood what it needed. She picked one and held it in both hands for a moment. Then she looked at Vernon and Ida standing at the end of the row and said she was going to need considerably more shelf space in her research collection. Leonard laughed from 2 rows over. He had been listening. Mayor Crane came to the harvest. Nobody had invited him, but nobody turned him away either, and he walked the rows with his hands in his coat pockets and looked at what the orchard had become, and did not say much. At the end of the afternoon, he found Vernon near the hives, and said that he hoped the preservation grant had been adequate, and that if there was anything the town could do to support the ongoing work, he hoped Vernon would not hesitate to ask. Vernon said he appreciated that. The mayor said he meant it. Vernon said he believed him. On the last evening of the harvest season, Vernon and Ida sat on a bench that Leonard had built for them at the southern end of the orchard, facing the rows of trees in the amber light of an October evening. The bees were quieting, coming home in the last warmth before the cold settled in. The trees stood in their rows, restored and productive, holding in their bark and their root systems and their specific varieties the 50-year knowledge of a man who had loved this orchard before them. Ida had the shared notebook open in her lap. The same composition book she had taken from the counter drawer on the February afternoon they had read the auction listing, now thick with a year's worth of entries, half her handwriting and half Vernon's, her drainage maps and hive observation notes alternating with his cultivation notes and both of their transcriptions from Voss's records. The margin conversations they had held with each other through the written page across a year of working the same land from different angles. She wrote the last entry of the season. Vernon was watching his bees come home. He said Voss had believed in someone he would never meet, had spent 50 years preparing something for a person he could not name, and had sealed it underground and simply trusted that the right person would come. Ida wrote that down. Then she closed the notebook and set it on the bench between them and leaned against her husband, and they sat together in the orchard as the light went from gold to amber to the soft gray of a good day ending. The bees came home, the trees held their harvest, and somewhere in the cold, dry air beneath the restored flagstone floor of a rebuilt barn, 43 empty shelves waited in the dark, their notebooks finally found, their message finally delivered, their patient faith in the finder finally kept. Before you go, I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly in the comments below. When Vernon and Ida stood in that root cellar and read the words for the finder written inside the cover of a notebook that had been sealed underground for 50 years, what did you feel? Whatever it was, I want to hear it. Leave it below. There is no wrong answer. Tell me where you are watching from today. This community reaches further than I sometimes expect, and I want to know where all of you are. And one more thing to sit with. Has there been someone in your life who prepared something for you before you knew you needed it? A grandparent who taught you something that only made sense years later? A neighbor who showed you how something worked and trusted you to carry it forward? A person who believed in your future without knowing your name? If that person is still in your life, I hope you find a way to tell them what that meant. Edgar Voss never knew. Not every finder gets to say thank you in time, thank you for staying to the end. The next story is coming, and I believe it will stay with you the same way this one did.